My video critique, I will talk about a lesson from my work sample. The subject of this lesson is spelling, and it is the second lesson in my 5-lesson unit. There are 3 students in this lesson, FA, CA, and NI. All 3 students are 4th graders that receive pull-out services in the Learning Center for writing. All of the students qualify for services under the eligibility of communication disorder. Academically, they are at a 2nd grade reading and writing level and all 3 of them have the same level of spelling words. This lesson took place on November 27, 2012. The topic is spelling. The grade level of the students are 4th grade, however the content is 2nd grade. The procedure of this lesson was as follows. I started the lesson by recapping the previous lesson in order to help students recall what they were working on in the last class as well as to activate their prior knowledge. I said, in the previous lesson I told you a story of when my friend invited me to her house to help her decorate her Christmas tree because I didn't have my own tree. Next, I moved on to today's agenda. Today's agenda was as follows. Look at our spelling words for the week and talk about how they were used in the story. Next, we're going to add words to the cartoon of the story that we talked about yesterday. Third, I went over behavior expectations using the cartoon that we had made in the previous day's lesson. The behavior cartoon included the following pictures. The students have their bottoms on their chairs, their feet under their desks, while they are making pictures in their head of what their classmates or myself were saying. The overview of this lesson is as follows. Using the cartoon that we made yesterday in the previous lesson, students will retell the I story. As they tell the story, I will write their words under the corresponding picture. I will retag any incorrect meaning that students may assign to the concepts. The goal of the lesson is as follows. Students will use the shape of ideas to acquire the correct letter patterns for their new 10 spelling words. The rationale is as follows. By writing out the names of the ideas of the pictures, the students see what the shape of the ideas look like written out. Seeing the names of the ideas provides visual motor overlap because when the students see the movement of my hand and the shape that it records, it gives students a visual representation of the shape of the idea. Talking about the new vocabulary words in the context of the story adds another layer of meaning to the vocabulary words while helping to scaffold literacy. The Oregon State standard that this lesson is based off of is Standard 2.L.2. Demonstrate command of the conventions of Standard English, capitalization, punctuation, and spelling when writing. The objectives of the lesson were as follows. Given written and verbal cartooning, relational language and questioning strategies, and oral retagging, the student will be able to orally name the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the story. In kid-friendly language, which I would use to explain to the students, the objective would sound like this. Students will be able to talk about the characters in the story, what the characters did, where the characters did those things, why the characters did the things they did, and how the characters went about doing those things. The second objective is the students will be able to orally use the vocabulary words, and the vocabulary words are to, help, nice, make, into, making, hear, and place, in semantically correct sentences within the context of the story. In kid-friendly language, that objective would sound like this. Students will be able to use the vocabulary in words correctly in the context of the story. The resources used for this lesson were the cartoon from the I story, which was created during the previous lesson, and a black marker. The following modifications and accommodations were made for this lesson. This group size has been reduced from 11 students to 3 students in order to have a 1-to-3 teacher-to-student ratio. This low ratio is vital to the success of these students since they all function at a pre-operational level cognitively. Although individuals at a pre-operational level are groupable, interactions between the teacher and student, when in the group setting, are in a one-to-one manner. The students do not actually exchange ideas between one another. Rather, they are working next to each other in a manner similar to parallel play. The spelling words featured in this lesson were selected by my cooperating teacher. These spelling words are leveled so that they are at the level that the students are at cognitively, which is approximately 2nd grade. Ideally, this accommodation would create greater opportunities for the students to be successful. This activity is based on Viconic language methods from the neurosemantic language learning theory, which are methods that are effective in teaching students with visual motor or motor axis learning systems. All of the students in this group have one of these two learning systems, so these methods present the information in a way that the students' learning systems can make meaning of it. Next, the students took out their spelling lists from their spelling folder to have as a reference in order to look at the shape of the words during our discussion. Next, I described each frame of the cartoon, which we had completed in the previous lesson, out of context. For example, I said, "This person is in the doorway of a house holding something in her hand." As I did this, the students described what was happening in the picture. As they described what was happening in the picture, I wrote exactly what they said on the lines below the picture and reassigned meaning to what they said as necessary. I expanded and extended upon the semantic relationships using agent-action-object and adding the agent-action-object to the writing. I also retagged any incorrect meaning that the students may have assigned to the cartoon. During this step, I encouraged students to use the vocabulary words when describing what was happening in the pictures by asking questions like, "How did I put the star on the tree? Did I toss it or throw it on the tree? I placed it on the tree so that the star would be stuck on the tree and not fall off." Placed was one of their spelling words. At the end of writing what was happening in the entire cartoon, I wrapped up. The first part of wrap-up was recapping what we did today. So I told students how today we added words to the pictures of the story of decorating Jill's tree. Next, I gave students a preview of what was going to be happening tomorrow. Tomorrow, you guys will draw your own pictures of what you think the spelling words mean. Next, I tried to genuinely compliment each student on correctly using his or her new spelling words that he or she had just learned. And lastly, the students cleaned up their area, returned their folders and pencil cases in their respective areas, and returned to their general education classrooms. As my assessment, I took anecdotal notes on the content of each student's contribution and participation in the lesson immediately after the lesson had concluded, as to recall the lesson as accurately as possible. I took note if students were able to modify their language after I had verbally retagged it. If the student did not change his or her language, I made note of it as evidence that he or she was not able to use what he or she heard to assign meaning to the concepts, or that the meaning was not assigned to the concept in a way that the student's learning system could make sense of it. My reflection of the lesson is as follows. Today's lesson was very split between each student. F.A. was separate from the group today because he needed to work on his assignment that was assigned by the general education teacher that day. Today, the students in Mr. W.'s class came with a new assignment, to draw a picture of the problem in their imaginative story from their general ed class. I feel that the success of today's lesson varied between each student. F.A. was separate from the group today because he needed to work on his assignment that was assigned by the general education teacher that day. Today, the students in Mr. W.'s class came with a new assignment, to draw a picture of the problem in their imaginative story from their gen ed class, as well as the solution. The priority of the SPED class in this school, as decided by the gen ed teacher and the special ed teacher, which I found out today, is to support the students in their assignments that are given by the general education teacher. Therefore, even if the special education teacher has her curriculum and plans for what she wants to do during the period, she needs to take preference and complete the general education assignment over her special education curriculum. If she does not take the time to support the students with the general education assignment, the students will most likely fall behind in the rest of their general education class because they are not able to do the work independently at the time when the rest of the class is working on it. The reason that F.A. was working on his Gen Ed assignment during this lesson is because my CT decided that CA and NI would work on this assignment when they came back to the Learning Center later in the day for math, even though they would be working on it during a math period and not a writing period. F.A., however, does not come back to the Learning Center to receive math services. Therefore, this was his only opportunity to work on this general education assignment with additional support. F.A. was working on his assignment at the same table that I taught my lesson at, except he sat at the other side of the table so that he would be further from the noise. And I did a great job today because his language was made up of a lot of semantically correct relationships. At the beginning of the story retell, he was using very general agents like she and he in sentences, such as, she called her and asked her. I asked him to use names to clarify who he was talking about in the story because I wasn't sure who he was referring to. I had reminded him twice after that to remember to use names, but after those 2 reminders, he consistently did so. The last student, C.A., would participate when I directly called her name and asked her questions, but other than that, she did not volunteer. She was looking at the chart during the conversations, however, so that made me think that she was listening to the information that had been shared. Her body language made it seem as though she was very sad today. For the first 10 minutes, she had her head on her hands and was looking down at the floor. Her eyes were very watery and puffy as though she had been crying, but when I asked her about it, she was very adamant about being fine. After observing today's lesson, my university supervisor noted the following strengths. She said that I showed the students respect and warmth. I gave clear directions and had a good explanation of the story. I also included the students' names in the story. By telling the students that I was not the best drawer as I proceeded to draw, I humanized myself, showing my students that I too have my own strengths and weaknesses. I gave clear directions to the students by first giving them an example, followed by guided instruction, and then independent work. I spent an equal amount of time with each student and used good questioning strategies. My CT had the following suggestions. She said that in terms of organization, I should in the future give the other students a task to accomplish while I catch up a student that was absent in the previous lesson, so that the students that are waiting are productive rather than disruptive. Also, being that this school is in a very low socioeconomic neighborhood, I was not aware that the school had a policy prohibiting talks about Christmas or the holiday season until the last week of school. I found that this was put in place due to the financial strain that this season can put on the families in this community. Therefore, in future instruction, I would use a non-holiday related iStory to introduce my content. Lastly, my supervisor suggested including phonics in my lesson in order to increase phonemic awareness.